The telegram was wrinkled and soft at the folds, like it had been opened and closed too many times. Greta Faulkner smoothed it against her knee on the bench outside Caldwell's post office, reading it again even though she had already memorized every word. Harvest work available. Iron Ridge Ranch. Report by Thursday. Fair wages. No references required. No references required. That was the part that mattered. That was the part that made her press the paper flat and fold it carefully back into the pocket of her coat, because every other door in this county had required something she couldn't give: a husband's name, a local recommendation, a face that didn't make people look twice and then look away. She was 34 years old, German-born, and built like someone who had been working since before she was old enough to understand what work meant. Her hands were rough. Her English carried an accent that made certain people smile in a way that had nothing kind behind it. She had arrived in Caldwell 3 weeks ago with a leather suitcase, $41, and a letter of recommendation from her last employer in St. Louis that she quickly learned meant nothing out here, where everyone knew everyone and strangers were tolerated at best. She'd applied at the grain warehouse. The foreman there, a thick-necked man named Burris, had looked her up and down without bothering to hide what he was thinking. "We need men who can lift," he said. "I can lift," Greta said. He laughed, not meanly exactly, more like the laugh of someone who finds a dog trying to open a door. "Ma'am, I'm sure you're a fine woman, but this isn't— I lifted grain sacks in St. Louis for 2 years," she said, 50 pounds each. "You want me to demonstrate?" He stopped laughing, but he still said no. The laundry on Clement Street said they were fully staffed. The hotel on 2nd Avenue said the same thing, though Greta had watched a girl no older than 16 walk out of that hotel with an apron still tied around her waist an hour earlier. The boarding house where she'd been sleeping charged her for each night regardless, and the money in her pocket was shrinking with the patience of a clock, slow and inevitable and unstoppable. She'd heard on her 3rd day in Caldwell that a woman named Dorothea Plank was hiring help at her dress shop. She'd gone in, and Dorothea had been almost kind about it. A soft-faced woman in her 50s who had looked at Greta's hands and said, gently but clearly, that her clientele expected a certain presentation, and she hoped Greta understood. Greta understood. She had been understanding it her whole life. She picked up her suitcase from the bench outside the post office and started walking toward the livery stable, where she'd arranged for a ride north toward the Ridge Country if she could find one. Thursday was 2 days away. The telegram hadn't said how far Iron Ridge was from Caldwell, but she'd asked around and gotten vague answers. 15 miles, maybe 20, up past the creek fork and then north through the dry grass country where the big ranches sat behind their fence lines like kingdoms with their gates down. A woman at the Mercantile had given her the most direct answer she'd received in weeks. "Iron Ridge?" The woman had tilted her head. "That's Colt Mercer's place. Nice enough man. Lost his wife 2 years back. Heard he's been struggling." She'd paused, looking at Greta with the particular attention of someone assessing a situation. "You going to apply for work out there?" "I already have the job," Greta said. The woman's expression had shifted, not unfriendly exactly, but recalibrating. "Mercer's a decent man," she said finally, as if that were both a recommendation and a warning. Dimmed. The wagon that took her north belonged to a feed supplier named Obie Watts, who was making his weekly delivery run and didn't mind the company as long as she didn't expect conversation. Greta didn't. She sat in the back among the feed sacks and watched the town of Caldwell shrink behind her and felt something in her chest loosen, the way a fist slowly unclenches when the reason for clenching has finally passed. She'd left Germany 6 years ago. She had come to America with her older brother Hans and her sister-in-law Marta, and for 3 years she had worked alongside them on a truck farm in Ohio where the winters were long and the summers were longer, and there was always more work than people to do it. She had been happy enough. Not joyful, not the way people described happiness in the stories she'd read, not light and abundant and free, but solid, purposeful. She had a place she went to sleep and a task waiting when she woke up, and that had been enough. Then Hans died of a fever in the winter of 1889, and Marta had remarried within the year to a man from Cleveland who was polite to Greta, in the particular way that people are polite to problems they are hoping will solve themselves. She had taken her savings and moved west, because west was what you did when the place you were standing had run out of room for you. Kansas had seemed promising. She'd worked a season near Wichita, picking cucumbers and then moving to a kitchen job at a hotel that had gone bankrupt before Christmas. She'd spent the winter in a boarding house trying to stretch her money and her patience in equal measure. And by spring, she was down to $41 and a collection of rejection letters she'd stopped saving because they all said the same thing in different arrangements of polite words. The wagon crested a low rise and the ridge country opened ahead of her. Long golden grass, the kind that moved in the wind like something breathing, and in the distance a dark line of buildings that might have been a ranch or might have been a shadow. She watched it grow slowly more distinct as Obie Watts's mules pulled them closer, and she felt that thing in her chest again. Not hope exactly, because she had learned to be careful with hope, but something adjacent to it, something that said maybe. Iron Ridge Ranch was larger than she expected and less impressive than the name suggested. The main house was solid, 2 stories, wood-framed, with a covered porch that ran the length of the front, but the paint had been peeling for at least 2 seasons, and one of the shutters on the second floor had come loose from its hinge and hung at an angle that suggested no one had gotten around to fixing it. The barn was big and in better repair, and she could see a bunkhouse behind it, and beyond that the long flat rectangle of a machine shed with its doors standing open. Obie Watts pulled up at the gate and let her down without much ceremony. "You want me to wait?" he asked. "No," she said. "Thank you for the ride." He nodded and clicked his mules forward, and she was left standing at the gate with her suitcase at her feet and the sound of someone hammering somewhere behind the barn. She went toward the hammering. The man doing it was crouched beside the corner post of a corral fence, driving nails with the short, efficient strokes of someone who had done it 10,000 times. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 38, 40, with dark hair gone gray at the temples and the kind of tan that comes from years of outdoor work rather than a single summer. He didn't look up when she approached, finished driving the nail, then stood and turned. His face was sharp-featured and tired, not unfriendly, but reserved in the way of someone who had stopped expecting pleasant surprises. "You'd be Miss Faulkner," he said. "I would," she said. He looked at her with the same careful assessment she had received a dozen times in the past 3 weeks, but there was something different in it. Less judgment, more information gathering, like he was trying to understand what he was looking at rather than decide how to feel about it. "Colt Mercer," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm, and he didn't adjust it for her, which she noticed and appreciated. "You said in the telegram, 'No references required,'" she said. "I meant it." He turned and started walking toward the house, gesturing for her to follow. "I had 3 men quit last month. Another 2 the month before that. Harvest starts in 10 days, and I'm short-handed and behind on equipment maintenance, and my cook left to get married in April and hasn't been replaced." He said all of this without drama, as if reciting a list. "I need someone who can work. Everything else is secondary." "I can work," she said. "Everyone says that." "Then you'll have to watch me." He glanced at her sideways, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "Fair enough," he said. It did. The kitchen was large and functional, and in a state of managed chaos that told her the cook had not been replaced, but that someone had been trying. There were dishes stacked in a way that was technically clean but not organized, and a pot on the stove that smelled of last night's beans, and a window above the sink that gave a view of the south field, where the wheat stood gold and heavy and ready. "How many men?" she asked. "7 in the crew? 2 more coming Thursday from town. Maybe 3 if the youngest Turner boy decides to show. Plus myself." He paused. "And now you. Where would I sleep?" "There's a room off the kitchen. Used to be the cook's room." He said it plainly, without apology. "It's small." "I don't need much space," she said. "I need to know where things are. The supply situation. What do you have and what are you short on?" He looked at her again with that assessing quality. "You want to go through the inventory today?" "I want to start tonight," she said. "If harvest is in 10 days and the cook has been gone since April, I'd rather know what I'm dealing with now than discover it at breakfast." There was a pause. Not long, maybe 3 seconds, but she could see something happening behind his eyes, some recalculation. "Pantry's through there," he said, pointing. "Cellar stairs are in the corner. I'll get you the ledger." The crew came in for supper at 6 o'clock, 7 men trailing into the kitchen with the particular exhaustion of people who had been working since before sunrise. Greta had spent 4 hours in the pantry and the cellar, taking stock. She knew now that they were low on flour, that the salt pork supply would last another 2 weeks if she was careful, and that someone had been cooking beans because beans were the one thing they had in abundance, but that the monotony of it was written on the faces of men who sat down expecting more beans and had long since stopped saying anything about it. She put a pot roast on the table. She'd found a tough cut in the back of the cellar, something that had been overlooked, probably because no one had known what to do with it. And she'd had 4 hours, which was barely enough but sufficient if you knew what you were doing. She'd done roasted carrots alongside it, and the last of some dried herbs she'd found in a tin that still had some life in them. And she'd made biscuits because flour was low, but not that low. And men doing harvest prep needed something more than beans to hold them together. The silence when she set the pot down was the particular silence of people who are trying not to react, because reacting might cause the thing to change. A young man at the end of the table, maybe 19, with a sunburned nose and ears that stuck out slightly, looked at the pot roast and then at her and said, "You the new cook?" "I'm the new everything," she said. "What's your name?" "Eli Turner," he said. "Eli, eat." He ate. They all ate. And when the pot was empty and the biscuits were gone, and the men were leaning back in their chairs with the particular looseness of people who have been fed properly for the first time in a while, Greta began clearing the dishes, and Colt Mercer sat at the end of the table watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not gratitude exactly, but something more complicated than that. Something that looked like a man beginning to understand that the problem he thought he had might be solving itself. She had the room off the kitchen. It was small, as promised. A narrow bed, a window that looked out at the yard, a hook on the back of the door for her coat. She unpacked her suitcase in 12 minutes because she did not have much to unpack. She set her hairbrush on the windowsill and her extra dress on the hook and put her $41, now $37, after the boarding house and the wagon ride, in the inside pocket of the coat. Through the wall, she could hear the sounds of the house settling, the distant low conversation of men in the bunkhouse, the creak of something in the barn that was probably a horse shifting its weight. Familiar sounds, working place sounds. She had slept in enough of them to know the particular quality of a place that was alive with purpose even when everyone in it was unconscious. She lay on top of the blanket. She was not cold yet, and looked at the ceiling and thought about the situation with the directness that she had learned was the only useful way to think about situations. The ranch was struggling. She had seen it in the peeling paint and the loose shutter, and in Mercer's face when he said, "I'm short-handed and behind on equipment maintenance," without any inflection, the way people describe catastrophes they have already made peace with. The kitchen inventory told her that someone had been managing costs very carefully for at least several months. The expensive things were gone, or nearly gone, and what remained was the cheap and filling and durable. You ran a pantry like that when you were watching every dollar. She thought about this telegram. No references required. A desperate man's concession. A man who had run out of the luxury of being particular. She thought about Victor Hale, whose name had come up at supper. Not directly, not with any drama, but she had been listening, the way she always listened. And she had heard one of the older men, a weathered hand named Roy, say something under his breath to the man next to him about Hale's assessor coming out again next week. And the other man had looked at his plate and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she intended to find out. Dad? By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the kitchen, renegotiated the supply delivery schedule with the merchant in Caldwell, who had come out on Wednesday with his wagon and been surprised to find himself talking to a woman who knew exactly what she needed and what she was willing to pay for it, and had identified 3 pieces of equipment in the machine shed that needed attention before harvest could begin. She hadn't intended to get involved with the equipment. She had walked through the shed on her second morning because she wanted to know the layout of the ranch. And she had seen the reaper binder sitting at an angle that wasn't right, and she had looked at it for a long time before she went and found Roy, who turned out to be the closest thing the ranch had to a mechanic. "That drive chain's going to go," she said, pointing. Roy looked at the chain, then at her. "What do you know about drive chains?" "My brother had a farm," she said. "The same machine, different make. The chain went in the middle of harvest and we lost 2 days. Roy looked at the chain again. Colt knows about it. Does Colt know when it's going to fail? No one knows when. The link on the third run from the left is cracked, she said. You can see it if you look at the right angle in the morning light. It'll hold for maybe 3 days of running, maybe 4. Roy was quiet for a moment. He crouched down and looked where she was pointing, and she watched him find it, the small crack that was spreading with the invisible patience of metal under stress. And she watched his expression change. I'll tell Colt, he said. Tell him we need a replacement link before Thursday, she said. Because that's when harvest prep starts, isn't it? How'd you know that? I've been paying attention. Roy stood up slowly and looked at her with an expression that was trying to settle somewhere but hadn't found its place yet. You're not just the cook, he said. I'm whatever needs doing, she said, and went back to the house to start breakfast. Colt found her at the kitchen table that evening, going over the supply ledger. He came in from outside, still carrying the smell of the fields, and stood in the doorway for a moment before he came to the table and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Roy tells me you spotted the drive chain, he said. Roy spotted it, she said. I just pointed him in the right direction. That's not what he said. She looked up from the ledger. Did you order the replacement link? Leaves Caldwell tomorrow morning. He paused. How did you know to look at it? I told Roy. My brother had the same problem. Roy says you knew the exact link. There was something careful in his voice, not accusatory, but precise. Not the chain looks worn, the specific link. She set down her pencil. Mr. Mercer, I have been working on farms and in supply houses for 15 years. I have fixed things that were told to me couldn't be fixed by women. I have managed kitchens, organized harvests, driven mules, and once helped reset a broken fence line in the middle of February because the man who was supposed to do it had gotten drunk and it needed doing. I am not going to apologize for knowing things. He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't asking you to, he said. Good. Another pause. He looked at the ledger on the table between them. What are you working on? He asked. Supply projections for harvest week, she said. You're going to need more than you have. I want to put in an order by Friday. I'm not sure I have the cash flow. I found 2 line items in the March accounts where you were overcharged, she said. She turned the ledger and pushed it toward him, pointing. Here and here. The merchant overcharged you on salt and on lamp oil. If you take that up with him, you should get credit that covers most of what you need. He looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. I didn't know about these, he said. No, she said. I figured. She wasn't trying to make him feel bad about it, but she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't there either. The numbers were the numbers. He looked up from the ledger and his face had that complicated expression again. The one she had seen at supper on her first night, the one she still couldn't entirely read. He was a man who had gotten used to managing things alone, and he was looking at her like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just felt someone else's hand on the other side of the weight. Thank you, he said, and it was simple and direct and didn't have any performance in it. I'll have the supply order ready by Friday morning, she said, and picked up her pencil. On Saturday afternoon, 10 days before the harvest was due to begin, a man in a suit came out from Caldwell in a clean buggy. He had a leather satchel and a way of getting out of a vehicle that involved making sure his shoes didn't touch the dirt any longer than necessary. Greta watched him from the kitchen window. He went to the front door and knocked, and Colt met him there. She couldn't hear what was said, but she could read something in the posture of both men. Colt's shoulders gone slightly rigid, the visitor's chin at a particular angle that she recognized from men who had the legal advantage in a situation and knew it. He was inside for 40 minutes. When he came out, Colt walked him to the buggy, and they shook hands in the way that people shake hands when they are observing a formality rather than expressing goodwill, and then the buggy rolled back down the drive toward Caldwell. Colt stood in the yard for a moment after it was gone. Then he came inside. He went directly to his office, a small room off the main hall that she hadn't been invited into. And she heard the door close. Not slammed, just closed, firmly, the way you close a door when you want to be somewhere alone with something difficult. She finished the biscuits she was making and let him have his hour. When she knocked and came in with coffee, he was sitting behind the desk with papers spread in front of him, and he looked up at her with the face of a man who is deciding how much to say. "That was Victor Hale's assessor," he said. "I thought so," she said. She set the coffee down and didn't leave. He looked at her, then he looked at the papers. "The loan's due at the end of the season," he said. "Hale extended it last year on the condition that I make payment in full after harvest. If I don't—" He stopped. "If harvest doesn't cover it, he has the right to foreclose." "How much is the gap?" she asked. He told her. She did the arithmetic in her head. "That's not impossible," she said. He looked at her with something that might have been exasperation. "The harvest has to go perfectly. No losses, the price stays where it is, and I have to get it all in before the storm season." "I know," she said. "I've been watching the sky. We have time." She paused. "What exactly are the terms of the loan?" He looked at her oddly. "It's a standard ranch mortgage." "Can I see it?" He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him deciding something, whether to be insulted or whether to hand over the paper. He handed it over. She read it standing there. She read it twice. She handed it back. "This isn't a standard ranch mortgage," she said. "What do you mean?" "The interest calculation is irregular," she said. "The compounding schedule, that clause on page 3. That's not how it's usually written." Colt frowned. "The lawyer in town drafted it." "Which lawyer?" He said the name. She didn't know it, but she filed it away. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully. "I'm not saying anything I can prove yet, but I'd like to look at this more closely, if you'll let me." He studied her face. "You know mortgage law?" "I know numbers," she said, "and I know when they don't add up to what they're supposed to add up to." He nodded slowly. It wasn't permission exactly, more like a door that had been pushed and had swung open an inch. "After supper," he said. "We'll look at it after supper." She went back to the kitchen and finished the biscuits, and she thought about the man with the leather satchel and the clean shoes, and the way Colt's shoulders had gone rigid, and the clause on page 3 of the loan document that wasn't written the way loan documents were written, and she thought about what it meant that Victor Hale had sent an assessor out to a working ranch 10 days before harvest. You didn't send an assessor to see if a man was going to make it. You sent an assessor when you had already decided he wasn't. She fed the crew their supper, and she listened to the conversation around the table. Roy talking about the equipment, Eli Turner asking about the storm forecast he'd heard from someone in town, and she looked out the window at the south field, where the wheat stood tall and golden in the late light, heavy with everything that had gone into it, waiting. She was going to make sure it got in. She didn't know how yet. She just knew that she was. The loan document sat on the kitchen table between them after supper, the pages spread out under the lamp like something that needed careful surgery. The rest of the crew had gone to the bunkhouse. The ranch had gone quiet in the particular way it did after dark. Not silent, but settled, the sounds reduced to the wind against the eaves and the occasional movement from the barn. Colt had brought the lamp closer and was reading the clause on page 3 that Greta had flagged, and she could see from the way his jaw tightened that he was finding what she had found. "Walk me through it," he said. "The standard structure for a harvest loan is simple interest calculated annually," she said. "What Hale's document does is compound it quarterly, but the language is buried here." She pointed to a subordinate clause in the middle of a long paragraph, the kind of language that was designed to be skipped over. "And it's written to look like a standard payment schedule until you do the actual calculation." "How much difference does it make?" She had already done the arithmetic. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's nearly $40 more than I thought I owed." "Yes. That's—" He stopped, rubbed his face with one hand. "That changes the numbers for harvest significantly." "It does." He looked at her. "How do you know how loan documents are supposed to be written?" It was a fair question, and she answered it directly. "When I worked at the supply house in St. Louis, I handled accounts receivable. We dealt with bank instruments regularly. The manager there, a man named Kessler, was meticulous about contract language. He made me read every document before we signed anything and explain back to him what it said. He said—" She paused, hearing Kessler's voice in her head, his careful German-accented English. He said the most expensive thing a business could do was sign something without understanding it. Colt looked at the document again. "I had a lawyer look at it." "The same lawyer Hale uses for his other business in town?" she asked carefully. His eyes came back to her, that tightening in his jaw again. I don't know, he said. It might be worth finding out, she said. He didn't answer that. He folded the papers and held them without putting them away, and she could see him working through something, not the numbers which he had absorbed, but something larger, the shape of the situation, the way it had been designed. If the interest calculation is wrong, he said slowly, does that change what I owe at harvest? If it can be demonstrated that the terms were misrepresented, yes, she said, but that's a legal question and I'm not a lawyer. Then what good does knowing it do me? She looked at him steadily. It means you know what you're dealing with, she said. And that's not nothing, Mr. Mercer. That's the difference between walking into a situation blind and walking into it with your eyes open. He sat with that for a moment. Then he gathered the papers and stood. I need to think about this, he said. Take your time, she said, but not too much of it. Harvest starts in 8 days. The crew was 12 men by Thursday morning, counting Colt and Greta and the 2 additional hands who arrived from Caldwell, brothers named Pete and Calvin Doss, weathered and laconic and skilled enough that Roy gave them an approving nod, which was the closest Roy came to a warm welcome. The youngest Turner boy, Eli's cousin Danny, showed up Thursday afternoon, 17 years old and trying to look older, and Greta put him to work sharpening blades in the machine shed because he needed something to do with his nervous energy, and the blades genuinely needed sharpening. The south field was the priority. 40 acres of wheat that had to be cut, bound, and stacked before the first hard weather came through, which the sky had been suggesting for the past several days in the way skies do. The quality of light in the late afternoon, the particular direction of the wind at dusk. Greta had been watching it the way she had learned to watch it on her brother's farm in Ohio, where reading the weather wasn't a skill so much as a necessity. She had also been watching the machines. The drive chain had been replaced on Tuesday, and that was good. But there was a secondary issue she had found on Wednesday when she walked through the machine shed during the lunch break, a worn bearing in the reel mechanism of the reaper that Roy had noticed, but ranked as a lower priority. She ranked it differently. If the reel bearing fails during the cut, you lose the whole mechanism, she said to Roy that afternoon. How long to replace it? Roy chewed on that. He was a deliberate man, and she had learned to let him have his silences rather than filling them. Half a day if I have the part. Full day if I have to fabricate something. Do you have the part? Might. Let me check the spares. He had half of what he needed and had to send Danny Doss into Caldwell for the rest, which ate up an afternoon but felt, to Greta, like the kind of expense that prevented a larger one. Colt came out to the shed while Roy was doing the replacement and stood in the doorway watching. Greta was beside Roy, handing him tools when he needed them and staying out of his way when he didn't. This wasn't in the maintenance schedule, Colt said. The maintenance schedule didn't catch it, she said. He looked at the bearing in Roy's hands, half seized with rust and grit. When would it have failed? Day 1 or day 2 of the cut, Roy said, not looking up. Maybe day 3 if we were lucky. Colt was quiet. Then, good catch. Roy would have gotten to it, she said. Maybe, Roy said honestly. Feeding 12 men 3 times a day during harvest prep was not a small task, and she was doing it while simultaneously managing the pantry replenishment, the supply schedule, and what she was increasingly thinking of as the intelligence problem, which was what she privately called her growing understanding of Victor Hale's position relative to Iron Ridge Ranch. She had asked questions carefully, not interrogating anyone, just listening and occasionally redirecting conversations in the way that good listeners can. A question here, a follow-up there, letting people talk about what they already wanted to talk about. Men who worked hard all day wanted to talk at supper, and Greta had discovered early that a kitchen was one of the best places in the world to learn things if you kept your hands busy and your expression neutral. She had learned that Victor Hale owned the Caldwell Commercial Bank and 2 grain storage operations in the county. She had learned that Iron Ridge Ranch sat on a water source, Mercer Creek, that fed the dry south quarter of the county during summer droughts, and that 3 other ranches in the area depended on access to that creek for their livestock. She had learned from Roy that Hale had approached Colt twice in the past 3 years about purchasing the ranch and had been refused both times. She sat with this information the way she sat with numbers, letting it arrange itself until it made sense. A banker who had tried twice to buy a property now held its mortgage. The mortgage had irregular terms. An assessor had visited 10 days before harvest. The gap between what Colt thought he owed and what he actually owed was significant, but not impossible to manufacture through careful language in a contract. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was a shape, and the shape was not one that happened by accident. She said none of this to Colt yet. He was carrying enough. She tucked it away and kept her eyes open. Harvest began on a Monday morning with the quality of light that suggested the day would be hot and clear, which was what they needed and what they got, at least for the first part of it. Greta was up at 4 o'clock, which was an hour before anyone else, because 12 men going into the fields needed a proper breakfast, and proper meant something that would hold them until noon without flagging. She made a large pot of oatmeal and fried salt pork and biscuits and strong coffee and had it on the table by 5:30. And when the crew came in from the bunkhouse in the gray pre-dawn with their eyes still carrying sleep, they ate with the focused efficiency of people who understood that the day ahead would demand everything they had. She watched them from the kitchen while she cleaned up. Eli Turner ate quickly and kept looking out the window at the lightening sky, the way young men do when they're anxious about proving themselves. Roy ate slowly and steadily, the way he did everything, and she saw him look at Pete Doss and exchange something, a nod, an understanding about the day's sequence, that didn't need words. Colt sat at the end of the table and drank 2 cups of coffee and didn't eat much, which she noticed and said nothing about. By 6 o'clock they were in the field. She stood in the yard and watched the reaper move into the wheat, the mechanical clatter of it, the way the standing grain folded and fell. And she felt something she had not expected to feel, a kind of pride that wasn't exactly hers, that belonged to the whole thing, the ranch and the people in it, and the months of work that had built toward this moment. Then she went back inside and got to work on the mid-morning provisions, because pride was well and good, but the men would need water and something to eat by 9 o'clock. Well, she brought the water out herself at 9:15, loading the canisters onto the ranch's small flatbed cart and driving it out along the edge of the field. The wheat was falling in long rows behind the reaper, and the crew was working to bind and stack, moving with the particular rhythm of people who know what they're doing. Not fast exactly, but efficient, the kind of efficiency that comes from repetition and doesn't waste motion. Eli Turner was struggling. She could see it from 30 yards away, the way his bundles were looser than the others, the time he lost retying what had come undone, the set of his shoulders that said he was aware of falling behind and was tightening up because of it, which made the problem worse. She distributed the water canteens and came back to where he was working and stood beside him for a moment without saying anything, watching his technique. "You're starting the tie too high," she said. He looked at her, defensive in the way of young men who are embarrassed. "I've done this before." "I know you have," she said, "but you're starting the tie too high and it's giving the bundle room to shift. Start here." She pointed to a spot lower on the gathered stems. "And pull toward you when you cinch it." He looked at where she was pointing. He was quiet for a moment, working through his pride. "Try one," she said. He tried one. It was better. Not perfect, but meaningfully better. "Okay," he said, not looking at her. "Good," she said, and went back to the cart. She was halfway back to the ranch when she passed Roy, who was walking from the machine shed toward the field carrying something she recognized as a wrench for the reel mechanism. "Trouble?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "Bearing's warming up, keeping an eye on it. How long until it's a problem? Few hours, maybe. Or maybe it holds." He shrugged in the fatalistic way of someone who has spent a lifetime managing equipment. "We'll see." She drove back to the ranch and started lunch, and she thought about the bearing and the sky, which had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough that she had noticed while she was in the field. The bearing held through Monday and most of Tuesday, which was good. What wasn't good was the sky on Tuesday afternoon, which had taken on a color and a quality that she had been watching with the tightening attention of someone who had grown up near Lake Erie and knew what weather building from the west looked like. She mentioned it to Colt at supper. "Storm's coming," she said. "Weather turns every week this time of year," he said. Not dismissively, but with the detachment of a man who had been farming this land long enough to discount minor variations. "Usually passes through." "This doesn't look like it's going to pass through," she said. He looked at her. "How long do you think we have?" "I don't know, 4 days, maybe 5. She paused. Maybe less. He was quiet for a moment. The calculation was happening in his face. The acreage they'd cut versus what remained. The days required at their current pace. The margin. We're behind, he said. Yes. How far behind? She had already done the math. If we maintain current pace, we'll be 2 days short when the storm hits. Maybe a day and a half if we extend the work hours. He set down his fork. The men are already going from sunup to past sundown. I know. I can't ask them for more than that. She was quiet for a moment. She had been thinking about this since she came back from the field and saw the bearing situation and looked at the sky again. She had been thinking about it while she made supper, turning it over the way she turned over numbers, looking for the piece that changed the sum. You have one less pair of hands in the field than you should, she said carefully. He looked at her. I'm not in the field, she said. The silence that followed was specific and full. He understood what she was saying, and she could see him working through his reaction to it, which was not one reaction but several, moving across his face in sequence. You're running the kitchen, he said. The kitchen can run on simpler meals for the next 3 days. The men need the food to hold them, not to be impressive. I can make it work with less time. The field work is, I know what it is, she said. I've done it. Greta. He used her first name for the first time, and she noticed and kept her face level. The men can think whatever they want to think, she said. We need the wheat in before that storm. That's the only thing that matters right now. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that wasn't quite argument and wasn't quite agreement, something that was fighting itself. Let me think about it tonight, he said. Of course, she said. She picked up the empty serving bowl and went to the kitchen, and she thought, he'll say yes in the morning because the numbers leave him no other choice. He said yes in the morning. He came into the kitchen at 5 o'clock while she was starting breakfast and stood in the doorway with his coffee cup and said, I need you in the field after breakfast. I know, she said. Roy will keep the binding schedule going. I want you working between Eli and Danny. They're the ones losing time. I figured, she said. Breakfast will be ready at 5:30. He started to leave, then stopped. He turned back part way. The men might not like it, he said. They don't have to like it, she said. They have to cut wheat. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It surprised her, the sound of it, rough and brief, like something that had found its way out without permission. He went back down the hall, and she heard him go out the front door, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with a slight smile that she allowed herself only because no one was watching. The men did not like it. This was clear within the first hour of the morning cut, in the particular way that collective disapproval makes itself known without anyone having to say a word directly. The glances, the slight reconfiguring of positions so that she was at the edge of the working formation rather than integrated into it. The performance of not noticing that was itself a form of notice. Pete Doss, the older of the two brothers, made the one direct comment. She had been working beside him for 20 minutes, keeping pace without difficulty, when he slowed and looked at her sideways and said, This work ain't really suitable for... I've got 13 rows to your 11 this morning, she said, without looking at him. You want to talk about suitable, or you want to keep moving? He looked at her, looked at the rows, didn't say anything else. By noon, she had worked herself into the rhythm of it, the physical engagement of it, the pulling and bending and the sharp smell of cut wheat and the sweat running down the back of her neck under her hat. Her hands knew what to do. They had always known. It was her face and her name and her accent that people kept deciding disqualified her from things her hands had already proved she could do. Eli Turner worked beside her for most of the afternoon, and she noticed that his bundles were better than yesterday. Consistently better, not just occasionally, and that he had stopped losing time on retying. He didn't say anything about this. Neither did she. But at one point, in the middle of a row, he looked over at her with an expression that was trying to be casual and said, You been doing this long? Long enough, she said. Where? Ohio. Before that, Germany. He was quiet for a moment, working. Then, my ma was from somewhere with a hard name, Pennsylvania Dutch country. She said people there thought women couldn't do anything useful either. She didn't answer right away, just kept her hands moving. Your ma sound like a smart woman, she said finally. He almost smiled. She had her moments. By Wednesday afternoon, two things had become clear. The first was that Greta in the field made a measurable difference. Roy had noticed it and said so to Colt without fanfare, simply reporting that the binding pace was up 11% since Tuesday. The second was that the sky was not cooperating with anyone's plans. The storm was moving faster than she had estimated. She had revised her estimate twice, once on Tuesday evening and once on Wednesday morning, and each revision moved the arrival window earlier. It was now looking like 3 days, not 4. Possibly 2.5. She said this to Colt at Wednesday's supper, and the calculation on his face was harder this time. "How much field do we still have?" she asked. 22 acres, he said. "Give or take. At current pace, we need 3 days minimum." "I know. Can we do it in 2? He rubbed the back of his neck. "Not with this crew at these hours, without burning them out." "What if we worked by lantern after dark?" He looked at her. "Night harvesting is difficult and slower and harder on the equipment," she said. "I know, but if the storm hits before we're done and we've lost the wheat, the difficulty doesn't matter." He was quiet for a moment. "There's also the question of the assessor," she said. "Hale's man is coming back Friday." "I know. If he comes on Friday and the field isn't done, I know, Greta." His voice had an edge in it. Not anger at her, but the friction of a man pressed against a wall. She let it sit there between them for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't mean to keep stating the obvious." "You're not," he said, more quietly. He stopped, looked at the table. "I've been fighting this thing for 3 years, since Margaret died. Some days I think I've been doing everything right, and the damn ground keeps shifting underneath me anyway." She didn't fill the silence. He hadn't asked her to. "She was good at this," he said, "managing the whole picture, seeing all the parts at once." He looked up. "I'm good at the field. The equipment, the actual farming, the rest of it." He made a gesture that encompassed, she thought, the ledgers and the loan documents, and the correspondence with bankers, and the particular vigilance required to run a business rather than just a farm. Margaret handled the rest of it. She thought about what to say and decided to say only what was true. "You've kept this place running for 2 years without her," she said. "That's not nothing." "Barely," he said. "Barely counts," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pushed back from the table and stood. "I'll talk to the men about the night hours," he said. "Volunteer only. I won't order them to do it, but if we get 4 or 5 willing to stay on after dark, we might close the gap." "I'll be there," she said. He started toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "You've been here 2 weeks," he said. 12 days, she said. 12 days, he repeated. He seemed to be working toward something, but not quite getting there, and finally he just shook his head slightly, as if the thing he was trying to articulate didn't fit into available language. "Good night, Greta." "Good night," she said. 7 men volunteered for the night shift, which was more than she had expected. Roy, Pete, and Calvin Doss, Eli Turner, and 2 of the other hands, older men named Garrett and Silas, who worked steadily and didn't talk much, and who she suspected stayed out of a combination of loyalty and the grim practicality of men who understood what it meant for the ranch to fail. The lanterns were hung at intervals along the row markers, and the light they threw was yellow and unsteady and changed the way everything looked, making the cut wheat look darker, making the faces of the men look like something from another century. It was slower than daytime work, as she had said it would be, but it was not negligible, and by 10 o'clock they had added 2 more acres to the total. She worked until midnight and then went to the kitchen to prepare the early provisions, because the men would need something before dawn, and she had calculated that she could get 4 hours of sleep if she started now. She was walking back to the house when she heard footsteps behind her and turned. It was Roy. He was carrying one of the lanterns and had the particular expression of a man who has decided to say something and has been working up to it for a while. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" she asked. He thought about it. Someone who'd last a week and go back to town. "I don't have a place to go back to," she said. Came out more plainly than she'd intended, but she didn't walk it back. Roy was quiet for a moment. "Where are you from, originally?" "Germany. Small town outside Dusseldorf." "Long way from home." "This is home," she said. "Right now this is home." He looked at her with that calibrating expression, the same one he'd had in the machine shed the first week. the one that was still sorting out where to put her. "You're good at this work," he said. "All of it. The kitchen, the field, the—" He gestured vaguely, meaning the machinery, the books, all of it. "Colt doesn't usually take to people quickly, but he listens to you." "He's sensible," she said. "He is," Roy agreed. "Also stubborn and closed off and not great at asking for help." He said it with the affection of a man who has worked alongside someone long enough to know their faults and accept them. Margaret used to say he'd starve before he'd ask someone to pass the bread. She smiled at that. "How long did she run this place before she died?" 8 years, Roy said, "since they were married. She was sharp, knew things, kept track of everything." He paused. "Hale came around the first time about a year after she passed, made an offer. And Colt refused. Colt told him to get off the property," Roy said, and there was a slight satisfaction in his voice. "But Hale doesn't take no for what it is. He just—" Roy paused, seeming to choose words. "Repositions." She stored that. "Good night, Roy," she said. "Thank you for the extra hours tonight." "It's my ranch, too," he said simply, meaning it in the way that a man who has worked a place for a decade means it, not in law, but in something older than law. He lifted the lantern and went back toward the field, and she went inside. She slept 4 hours and got up before dawn and started the biscuits. And she thought about Victor Hale repositioning, and about the assessor coming Friday, and about the 20 acres still standing in the south field, and about the sky, which she checked through the kitchen window when the first gray light came, and which told her, with the patient and indifferent honesty of weather, that they were running out of time. Thursday came in gray and close, the sky the color of old pewter from the first light, and Greta stood on the porch at 5 in the morning with her coffee and watched the horizon to the northwest, where the darkness was a different quality than the rest of the dark. Denser, more purposeful. She had seen skies like that before. Not often, but enough. She went inside and made breakfast and said nothing about it, because the men already knew, and saying it again would only tighten what was already tight. Colt was in the kitchen before anyone else, and he came in looking like a man who hadn't slept much, which she suspected was accurate. He poured his coffee and stood at the window beside her, both of them looking at the same piece of sky. "How long?" he said. "Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow morning at the latest." She paused. "I don't think we get 2 days." He drank his coffee. "We've got 16 acres left." "I know. Can't do 16 in 1 day, not even close." "No," she said, "but we can do 11 or 12, which means the question is how much rain comes with the storm and how long it stays. And if it stays more than 2 days, the rest of the week goes down." "Yes." He set his cup on this counter with a deliberateness that was the only outward sign of what that meant to him. She watched his profile, the muscle working in his jaw, the particular stillness of a man calculating losses. "I'll take what we can get," he said finally. "Let's make today count." The morning's work was the hardest yet, and the sky made it worse by being simultaneously calm and threatening. No wind to speak of, the air heavy and warm and wrong, the kind of stillness that wasn't peace, but pressure building. The men worked without much talk. Even Eli, who usually had something to say, was quiet in a focused way that she respected. She had moved her kitchen duties to the absolute minimum for the day. Bread made at 4 in the morning, a large pot of stew left to simmer on the low flame, provisions loaded onto the cart and driven out at intervals so that no one lost more than 10 minutes to eating. Every hour in the field today was a calculation. It was mid-morning when Roy found the problem. She was on her third water run when she saw him crouched at the side of the reaper with his hand inside the housing, and the machine was stopped, and that was enough. She pulled the cart up and climbed down. "What is it?" she said. "Drive belt," Roy said. His voice was flat in the way of bad news. Worn through, snapped at the seam. She crouched beside him and looked. The belt had failed where it connected the main drive shaft to the cutting bar, which meant the cutter was entirely down. Without the cutter, the reaper was a large, expensive piece of useless iron. "Spare belt?" she said. "Used it in July," Roy said. "Hadn't replaced it yet." She stood up. Around them, the crew had stopped working. There was nothing to bind without the cutter running. And she could feel the collective weight of the pause, men looking at each other and then at the machine and then at Colt, who was walking toward them from the far end of the row with a stride that said he had seen the machine stop from a distance and was already asking himself the same question she was asking. "Belt's gone," Roy said when Colt arrived, and there was a pause in which everyone absorbed this. "Closest replacement?" Colt asked. "Caldwell," Roy said. "Hollis's implement shop." "How long to get there and back?" "Hour and a half each way if you push the horse," which meant 3 hours minimum. 3 hours in which 12 people stood in a field while the sky continued to do what the sky was doing. She watched Colt do this math and watched his expression go through the same sequence hers had gone through. "I'll go," Pete Doss said. "Take my roan," Colt said. "She's faster than the supply horses." Pete was already moving toward the barn. Colt turned to the crew. "While the cutter's down, we manual bind what's already been cut," he said. "Nothing stops. Roy, can you do anything with the belt in the meantime?" "I can jury-rig something that might hold for an hour," Roy said. "Maybe, but we'll chew through it fast and then we're worse off than before." "Hold off on that," Colt said. "We wait for the proper part." "What about the north corner?" Garrett asked. He was one of the older men, Silas's partner, and he was pointing to the section of field they had intended to reach last. "If we lose it to weather, that's still 4 acres. "I know," Colt said. 4 acres is— "I know what 4 acres is, Garrett," Colt said, not unkindly, but definitely finally, and Garrett nodded and went back to the binding work. Greta went back to her cart, and she was halfway through distributing water when a thought arrived that she turned over twice before she trusted it. She brought the empty canisters back to the ranch and went to the machine shed and spent 20 minutes looking at the parts supply with the same attention she had given to the pantry on her first day. Old belts, worn belts. A stack of them in the corner, various sizes, none the right specification, but close enough maybe, if you thought about it differently. She took 2 of them back to where Roy was sitting beside the stopped machine. "Can you splice these?" she asked. Roy looked at them, looked at her. "Splice 2 worn belts together and run a cutter off it?" "Not run it at full speed," she said. "Run it at reduced speed, 70% maybe. It'll be slower, but it won't blow the mechanism, and we'll get something done while Pete's gone." Roy picked up one of the belts and stretched it, testing the leather. He did the same with the second one. His expression was the careful neutral of a man who doesn't want to commit to something he isn't sure about. "It might hold," he said. "It might also fail catastrophically and damage the cutting bar, in which case we're worse off." "What's the probability it fails catastrophically?" "I don't know. Maybe 1 in 4? She thought about this. "And the probability that waiting 3 hours for the proper belt puts us past the point where the storm arrives before we can use it anyway?" Roy looked at the sky. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Try the splice," she said. "Reduce speed. I'll watch it and pull the signal if I see it starting to go." Roy was quiet for a moment, turning the belts in his hands. "You're going to watch the cutting mechanism?" "Someone has to," she said. "You'll be managing the splice and the drive. You can't watch both." He looked at her with that expression she had come to understand as his version of respect, which was nothing dramatic, just a slight softening, a slight relaxation of the skepticism that was his default position toward everything and everyone. "All right," he said. Months. The splice held. It ran rough and slower than normal, and every 20 minutes Roy had to stop the machine and check the tension, and Greta stood beside the cutting bar watching the splice point with the focused attention of someone who has agreed to notice the thing that matters before it becomes the thing that breaks everything. But it held. For 2 hours and 40 minutes, until Pete Doss came back across the field at a lope, with the proper belt rolled under his arm and his horse blowing from the effort. The spliced belt kept the cutter running. They lost 40 minutes total. The initial failure, Roy's assessment, the time to rig the splice. If they'd waited for Pete to return with nothing running, they would have lost nearly 3 hours. Colt came to find her after the proper belt was installed and the machine was running at full capacity again. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her watching the reaper move back into the wheat. "Roy told me about the splice," he said. "Roy did the actual work," she said. "Roy said it was your idea and you watched the mechanism for 2.5 hours while he drove the machine." She didn't answer. "Where did you learn to think about problems like that?" he asked. She considered the question. "I don't know," she said honestly. "When I was a girl, my father fixed everything himself because we couldn't afford to pay anyone. He used to say that most solutions were already in the room if you were willing to look at what you had instead of wishing for what you didn't. Colt was quiet for a moment. Smart man. He had his moments, she said, which was what Eli had said about his mother, and she felt the small echo of that and smiled slightly before she caught herself. Colt noticed. What? Nothing, she said. Let's go back to the field. Otang. They cut 9 acres by 4 in the afternoon. Not the 11 or 12 she had hoped for, not with the belt delay, but 9 was solid and the remaining 7 were the ones they couldn't finish regardless. So the question was now purely about the storm's timing and their luck with it. The storm answered that question at 4:30. It came from the northwest the way she had expected. Fast and purposeful, the wind picking up ahead of it so that the cut wheat stirred and lifted, and the men in the field looked toward the horizon and then at each other with the expression of people who are calculating whether to stay or run. The sky went green-gray in the northwest, which was the color that meant business, and Colt made the call from the far end of the south field. "Get the equipment in," he shouted. "Now, everything in the shed, move!" They moved. What followed was not panic. It was too organized for panic. These men had all seen weather come in fast before then, but it was urgent in a way that stripped everything else away. The Reaper went into the shed first, Roy and Pete Doss driving it, while Colt and the others stacked the cut and bound wheat as high and fast as they could against the barn wall, where the overhang would give it some protection. Greta was in the yard doing what she could, moving the supply cart under cover, securing the barn doors that had a tendency to swing, dragging a loose piece of tarpaulin she found against the fence line over the nearest stack of wheat. The wind hit properly at 5 o'clock. Not a gradual increase, but a sudden escalation, the kind that made you grab whatever was nearest and brace. She was in the yard between the barn and the house when it came, and she felt the full force of it. Not enough to knock her down, but enough that she had to put her shoulder into it and lean. The tarpaulin she'd been securing ripped out of her hands and went sideways. She let it go. There were other things to secure. She was heading for the barn when she heard Eli shout. She turned and couldn't see him at first. The wind had kicked up enough dust from the dry ground to reduce visibility, and then she located him near the south fence line, 50 yards from the barn, and she saw that he wasn't alone. He was trying to pull someone, and the person with him wasn't moving well. She ran. The wind made it harder than it should have been, and the ground was uneven at the fence line. But she got there in under a minute and found Eli with his arm around Colt, who was on one knee beside the fence post with his hand pressed to his head, and blood, not a lot of it, but enough to show red through his fingers, running down the side of his face. "What happened?" she said, crouching beside them. "Fence post came down in the wind," Eli said. His voice was tight with the controlled, not panicking quality of a teenager trying hard. "Hit him on the side of the head. He went down." "I'm fine," Colt said, which was what people said when they weren't sure if they were fine. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes," he said, and proved it by standing, though she and Eli both kept a hand on him in case. "We're going to the house," she said. "Eli, stay on his left side. Don't let him stop moving. The wind's going to get worse." They made it to the house. It took longer than it should have, because Colt was steadier on his feet than she'd feared, but not entirely steady, and the wind by this point was gusting hard enough that walking into it required actual effort. She got them through the front door and shut it behind her against the wind, and the sudden reduction in noise was almost disorienting. She sat Colt in the kitchen chair and looked at the cut on his temple. It was superficial. Head wounds bled dramatically for how minor they often were, and this was no exception. But there was swelling developing beside it, which concerned her. "How's your vision?" she said. "Fine." "Headache?" "Some." "Hold up 2 fingers," she said. He held up 2 fingers. "How many am I holding up?" She held up 3. "3," he said, with a slight irritation that was actually reassuring. A man too foggy to count wouldn't have the energy to be irritated about being asked. "Good," she said. "Stay sitting. Eli, there's clean cloth in the second drawer beside the stove." Eli got the cloth. She wet it and pressed it to Colt's temple, and he hissed slightly but didn't pull away. "The wheat," he said. "Roy and the others are handling what can be handled," she said. "The north corner." "Colt." She said it firmly and looked directly at him. "Sit still for 5 minutes. The north corner will be what it is. Sit still." He sat still, which was either because she was right or because the cut was worse than he wanted to admit, and she suspected it was some of both. Eli hovered in the kitchen doorway, looking between Colt and the window, where the storm was now fully present, rain coming sideways, the light gone almost entirely, the sound of it against the roof a continuous percussion that rose and fell with the gusts. "Should I go back out?" Eli asked. "No," she said. "If Roy needs help, he'll come for us. Standing in that yard right now is how you get hurt." Eli stayed. Maset. The storm ran its worst over the ranch for 2 hours, and when the rain gentled toward evening and the wind began to ease, Colt was on his feet again, still with dried blood at his temple and the swelling she hadn't been able to do much about, but functional and insisting on going outside to assess. She went with him. The barn was intact. The machine shed was intact. The bunkhouse had lost a section of roof overhang that had been poorly secured, and Roy was already up there with Calvin Doss patching it with what they had. The north corner of the south field, the 4 acres they hadn't reached, was flattened. She looked at it in the gray post-storm light and felt the specific grief of work undone, potential converted to mud. Colt stood beside her and looked at it. 4 acres, he said. The flatness in his voice was not the flatness of a man who didn't feel it. "The 9 we cut are protected," she said, "and the 5 acres on the east side of the barn took the storm better than I expected. The building blocked the worst of the wind." He didn't answer right away. She let him have the silence. "I need to do the calculation," he said finally. "The yield from what we saved against what hail needs." "I already did it," she said. He looked at her. "With the north corner lost, you're going to be short," she said. "Not by much, but short." "How short?" She told him the number. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough. It was the difference between making the payment and not making the payment, and given the irregularities she'd found in the loan terms, the gap felt designed. He turned away from the field and walked back toward the house, and she walked with him, and neither of them said anything for a while. Roy was coming down from the bunkhouse roof when they passed. He looked at Colt and then at Greta and read the situation in their faces. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough," Colt said, "but we're standing." Roy nodded slowly. "Storm like that," he said, "a man counts what's left, not what's gone." "I know, Roy," Colt said, with a weariness that didn't diminish the gratitude underneath it. They sat at the table after supper, Colt and Greta and the loan document and the ledger, and the house was quiet except for the dripping of the eaves outside. The storm reduced now to a memory of itself. She had done the calculation 3 times. It came out the same every time. "If the terms are what the document says they are," she said, "you're short $38 and some change, which Hale will use as grounds for default." "And if the terms are not what they should be?" Colt said. He was watching her with an expression that had given up something, some resistance, some self-sufficiency he had been maintaining, and what was underneath it was simpler and more tired and more honest. "If the compounding clause is fraudulent, which I believe it is, then you may actually have overpaid," she said, "and the basis for default doesn't exist." "Can you prove that?" "Not by myself," she said. "I'd need to talk to someone with legal knowledge, and I'd need to see Hale's other loan documents, the pattern of this clause, whether it appears elsewhere, whether it's a consistent practice." "The assessor comes tomorrow morning," Colt said. "I don't have time to find a lawyer by tomorrow morning." "I know," she said, "but tomorrow is not the end of this. An assessor visit is not a foreclosure. There are legal steps between here and there, and each step takes time." He looked at her steadily. "You know a lot about this." "I know enough," she said, "and what I don't know, I can learn. I learned to read the loan document in 3 hours. I can learn the legal procedures." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he said. She frowned slightly. "Why what? Why are you doing this?" His voice was level, but the question wasn't casual. "You came here for harvest wages. You've been here 12 days. You fixed the machinery and reorganized the kitchen and worked the field alongside the men, and now you're—" He gestured at the documents between them. "Doing this. You don't have to do this." She thought about how to answer that, and the thing she settled on was the truth, which was simpler than anything she might have constructed. "Because it's wrong," she said. "What he's doing to you is wrong, and I know it's wrong, and I can't unknow it." He held her gaze. and because I've spent 15 years having doors closed in my face by men who had decided what I was before they knew anything about me," she said, more quietly. "Victor Hale is that kind of man. I know him on sight, and I'm tired of that kind of man winning." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something understood between two people who have been working alongside each other long enough that certain things don't need elaborating. "The assessor comes at 9, Colt said finally. "I'll be here," she said. "Greta." He said her name the way he'd said it twice before. Not formal, not distant, but direct. "If this goes the way Hale intends it to go, if we can't find a way to stop it, we'll find a way," she said, one step at a time. He nodded. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he looked like a man who had decided to walk forward anyway, which was good enough. The assessor arrived at 9:15 on Friday morning. His name, as she had previously noted, was a man named Ferris, compact and precise, with a leather case and the careful neutrality of someone who had long ago decided that professionalism meant not having expressions. He asked to speak with the owner of the property. Colt met him in the front room. Greta brought coffee and stayed. Ferris looked at her when she sat down. "This is a private assessment," he said. "I'm the ranch manager," she said. Ferris looked at Colt. Colt looked at her with the briefest pause and then back at Ferris. "She stays," he said. Ferris made a small note in his ledger with the expression of a man who is recording an irregularity for the record. "Mr. Mercer, I'm here to complete a status assessment of the property and its current yield position as required under Section 4 of the loan agreement." "Go ahead," Colt said. Ferris went through his questions in an orderly way. Acreage cut, acreage lost, projected yield, current cash position. He asked each question and wrote the answer down without inflection, which she watched carefully because the questions themselves were the interesting part. They were designed to isolate the shortfall and document it cleanly, without context. The storm, the timing, the machinery failure, the calculation irregularities in the loan document were not part of Ferris's question structure. When he paused to make a notation, she spoke. "Mr. Ferris," she said, "are you recording the circumstantial cause of the yield loss?" He looked up. "My assessment covers yield position and financial status." "The yield loss is directly attributable to a natural weather event," she said. "A storm system that struck Thursday evening, documented by 3 neighboring properties, and verifiable through the weather records kept at the Caldwell post office. A complete assessment would note the cause, not simply the outcome." Ferris looked at her with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being addressed this way during an assessment. "Ma'am, the terms of the loan, she said, include a compounding interest calculation that differs from the standard schedule communicated to Mr. Mercer at the time of signing." She set the loan document on the table between them, open to page 3. "Specifically, this clause, which compounds quarterly rather than annually, and was not explained as such during the initial agreement." Ferris looked at the document. He looked at it for a longer moment than a man simply confirming he recognized it would need. "I'm not here to evaluate the loan terms," he said. "No," she said, "but a judge might be." The word judge landed in the room with a weight she had intended. Ferris's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind it, a slight recalibration. "Mr. Mercer," Ferris said, turning back to Colt, "if you have concerns about the loan terms, those would be a matter to raise with Mr. Hale directly." "We intend to," Colt said. He said it with a steadiness that told her he had decided, sometime between last night and this morning, to follow her lead on this. She was grateful for the trust, and she didn't let it show on her face. Ferris finished his assessment in 20 minutes, made his notations, closed his case with a precise snap, and left. They watched the buggy go down the drive. Colt turned to her. "You called his bluff." "He doesn't have a bluff," she said. "He has a procedure. We disrupted the procedure. That buys us time." "How much time?" "Enough," she said. "Maybe, if I can get to Caldwell before Hale processes the assessment report." "What are you going to do in Caldwell?" "Find out who else Hale has done this to," she said, "because I don't think Iron Ridge is the first." The afternoon was clear. The storm had washed the sky clean, and the air had that particular sharpness that follows bad weather. And she drove the supply cart into Caldwell herself, telling Colt she needed to resupply and that this was true. The resupply was secondary. She went to the county records office first. The records clerk was a thin, precise woman in her 40s named Mrs. Boone, who looked at Greta with the assessing quality of someone whose job required her to deal with many kinds of people and who had developed a system for categorizing them quickly. Greta told her she was trying to verify standard mortgage terms used in the county and asked whether loan documents were filed as public record. Instruments of property encumbrance are filed at the clerk's office. Yes, Mrs. Boone said. What property are you asking about? I'm not asking about a specific property, Greta said. I'm looking at a pattern in the loan terms of several properties, specifically properties that carry mortgages through the Caldwell Commercial Bank. Mrs. Boone looked at her more carefully. You're asking to review multiple loan filings. Yes, that's permitted, Mrs. Boone said slowly, as their public record, but it's not a quick process. I understand, Greta said. I'll take whatever time is necessary. She spent 2 hours in the records office. Mrs. Boone, who had initially been careful in the way of officials who are not sure what they're facilitating, became gradually more cooperative as the afternoon wore on, either because she had decided Greta was not a problem, or because there was something in what Greta was finding that justified her own interest. What Greta found was a pattern. 4 other properties in the county carried Caldwell Commercial Bank mortgages with the same quarterly compounding clause on page 3, or its equivalent. 3 of the 4 were properties that shared water access with Mercer Creek. 2 of those 3 had already defaulted, and both properties were now owned by a holding company whose registered agent was a name she didn't recognize but whose address was the same building as the Caldwell Commercial Bank. She sat with this for a moment, looking at the documents spread in front of her, and she felt the satisfaction of a shape finally completing itself. Not pleasure, because what she was looking at was not pleasant, but the specific clarity of understanding, of seeing the mechanism fully assembled for the first time. She copied down what she needed, thanked Mrs. Boone, and went to find the supplies she had told Colt she needed. She was loading the cart outside the mercantile when she found herself face to face with Victor Hale. He came down the boardwalk with the confidence of a man on his own ground, and he stopped when he saw her. Not surprised exactly, but recalibrating. He was 60 or so, well-dressed in the way of men who use clothes to signal authority, with a trimmed gray beard and eyes that she recognized as the eyes of a man who was accustomed to measuring people against their usefulness to him. You're Mercer's cook, he said. Ranch manager, she said. He studied her for a moment with the interested detachment of someone encountering an unexpected variable. Ferris mentioned you were present at this morning's assessment. I was, she said. That was an unusual move, he said. Mercer usually handles things himself. Things change, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The silence was not uncomfortable for him. This was a man who used silence the way certain people used furniture, as something to arrange in his favor. The assessment results will be submitted to the bank by end of business today, he said. Given the yield shortfall, the loan will likely be called next week. Likely, she said. Unless Mr. Mercer can find a way to cover the gap, Hale said. He said it with a particular smoothness, the kind that offers a possibility while making clear it is not a real one. Which, given his current situation, she said, it might be worth his while to have a lawyer look at the loan terms before anything is submitted anywhere. Something shifted in Hale's eyes. Very slight. The shift of a man who has just registered that the conversation is not going the way he expected. The terms are standard, he said. They're interesting, she said. I spent the afternoon at the county records office. Other people's terms are interesting too. She kept her voice entirely even. She did not want to threaten him. Not yet. Not openly. Because she didn't have enough for that yet. And overplaying a hand before it was full was worse than not playing it at all. She just wanted him to know that she knew something, that the variable had a name and was paying attention. His expression settled back into its practiced smoothness. I hope Mr. Mercer can resolve his situation, he said, with the cadence of a man who does not hope this at all. I'm sure you do, she said, and went back to loading the cart. She drove back to Iron Ridge in the clear afternoon, the sky a washed blue above the golden and brown patchwork of the storm-hit fields, and she thought about what she had found in the records office, and about the shape of what she needed to do next, and about the fact that she was 34 years old, in possession of $37 and change, and currently considering spending every cent of it to keep a man she had known for 12 days from losing everything he had. She thought about this carefully. She thought about the room off the kitchen and the crew that had stopped leaving her the outside edge of the work formation, and Roy's quiet declaration that the ranch was his too, and Eli Turner getting his bundles right, and Colt saying Margaret handled the rest of it with the particular grief of a man who had been struggling to do 2 jobs alone for 2 years. She thought about the 4 properties in the records office, 2 already gone. The water rights to Mercer Creek going with them, piece by piece, into a holding company whose name nobody recognized because that was the point. She pulled the cart into the yard and unhitched the horse and put it in the barn, and she went inside and found Colt at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the expression of a man doing math that isn't coming out the way he needs it to. She sat down across from him. "I found 4 other properties," she said. "Same clause, same bank. 2 of them have already gone into default. Both are now held by a company whose registered address is the Caldwell Commercial Bank building." Colt was very still. "He's been doing this systematically," she said. "Iron Ridge isn't a misfortune, it's a target." The silence lasted a long time. "I also ran into Hale on the main street," she said. "He told me the loan will be called next week." "How much time does that give us?" "Not enough to raise what he says we owe," she said, "but possibly enough to challenge what he says we owe in the first place." She paused. "I want to give you my savings." He looked at her. "What?" $37, she said. "It won't close the gap entirely, but combined with the yield revenue, it narrows it to a number we might be able to argue down if we can get the interest calculation corrected." "Greta, it's a loan," she said. "You can pay me back when the ranch is stable, or you can pay me back in wages over the winter. I don't particularly care how. I care that we have something to work with when we walk into that conversation." He stared at her. He had learned his face well enough by now to read most of what was moving across it. The pride that made accepting help feel like conceding something, the exhaustion underneath that, the calculation, and under all of it, something she didn't have a clean word for, something that was partly gratitude and partly the expression of a man who has been alone in a hard situation long enough that the presence of company has become almost overwhelming. "I can't ask you to do that," he said. "You didn't ask," she said. "I'm telling you, there's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the washed evening light was doing something gentle to the yard, the way light does after a storm, everything a little more vivid than usual and a little more fragile. She held his gaze and did not look away. "All right," he said finally. It came out quiet. "All right." She nodded and opened the ledger between them. "Then let's figure out exactly what we have," she said, "and build the argument from there." They worked at the kitchen table until past midnight, and by the time Greta finally set down her pencil and pressed her palms flat against the wood to stretch her hands, they had something that looked, if not like a legal argument, at least like the skeleton of one. The ledger was covered in her handwriting, columns of numbers, marginal notes, the names of the 2 defaulted properties she had found in the records office, and the dates of their foreclosures, the registration date of the holding company whose address was Hale's bank building. She had also written out, in her most careful English, a summary of the quarterly compounding clause and how it differed from the annual schedule that was standard in the county, with a side-by-side calculation showing what Colt had been told he owed and what the document actually required him to pay. The difference was not subtle once you put the 2 figures next to each other. That was the thing about numbers. They didn't have a way of softening what they said. Colt had been reading over her shoulder for the last hour, following along without interrupting, which she had come to understand was how he processed complicated things, absorbing them completely before he responded. He straightened up now and looked at what she had written. "If I take this to the Caldwell courthouse," he said, "what am I taking it to? Who hears something like this?" "The circuit judge," she said. "Judge Aldrin comes through Caldwell on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of the month." "You looked that up?" "While I was at the records office." She paused. "Next Tuesday is the 4th Tuesday." He counted the days in his head. She watched him do it. "That's 5 days." "Yes." "Hale said the loan would be called next week." "He said likely next week," she said, "which means he hasn't filed the formal notice yet. A formal notice of default requires at least 3 business days before any foreclosure action can begin. If we file a counterpetition before he files the notice, she stopped because she was approaching the edge of what she knew for certain. I'm not a lawyer, she said again. I want to be clear about that. You keep saying that, Colt said, but you know more about this than any lawyer I could afford. That's a low bar, she said. He almost laughed. Almost. What do we need between now and Tuesday? She looked at the notes. 2 things. First, we need the testimony of one of the other affected properties. Someone who took a mortgage from Hale's bank and can show the same clause, the same misrepresentation of terms. A pattern is stronger than a single instance. You said 2 of the 4 defaulted. Yes, but the other 2 haven't. If either of them is willing to come forward, she paused, that changes the shape of what we're presenting from one man's complaint to a systematic practice. Colt thought about this. Ed Faraday runs the Broken Bow spread north of the ridge, he said slowly. I know he's been struggling, and I know he banks with Hale. He paused. He and I haven't always gotten along well. What does that mean? It means we had a disagreement about fence lines 3 years ago, and we haven't spoken much since. She looked at him. Can you get past that? He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was doing real work. I can try, he said. Second thing, she said, we need someone in Caldwell with legal standing to present this to the judge. A lawyer, an officer of the court, someone who can file the counterpetition properly. If we walk in there with handwritten notes from a ranch manager, he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with a directness that was neither joke nor deflection. Ranch manager, she agreed after a moment. We still need legal standing. He thought about it. There's a lawyer in town named Whitmore. Old, retired mostly. Used to practice in St. Louis before he moved out here. He paused. He and Hale don't get along. Why not? I don't know the full story. Something from years back. He rubbed his face. He might tell me to go to hell. He might, she said, but he might not. She looked at what she had written. What we have here is real. The numbers don't lie. If Whitmore looks at this and sees what I see, he'll know it's real too. Colt nodded slowly. He was looking at the documents the way she had looked at that northwest sky on Thursday morning, reading something, calculating something, making a decision that couldn't be unmade. I'll ride to Faraday's in the morning, he said, and then to Whitmore's in the afternoon. I'll come with you to Whitmore's, she said. He looked at her. Why? Because the numbers are mine, she said simply. I found them. I can explain them. And because Whitmore is going to have questions that you might not be able to answer without me there. He held her gaze for a moment. You're not going to stay back and manage the kitchen. The kitchen will manage itself for one afternoon, she said. A corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close to one. And in this light, at this hour, with the paper spread between them and the lamp burning low, it was enough. All right, he said. Tomorrow then. She was up before 4, which was not unusual, but this morning she moved through the kitchen with a particular economy of motion, getting things done quickly so she could think while her hands worked. She put the oatmeal on and started the coffee and thought about Victor Hale. She had been thinking about him since the conversation on the boardwalk. Not with anger exactly. Anger was a feeling she had learned to convert into something more useful, but with the precise attention she gave to problems that were larger than they appeared. Hale was not a stupid man. He had constructed something careful and patient, built over years, and he had very nearly succeeded. What she had found in the records office was damaging, but not by itself conclusive. The clause in the loan document was suspicious, but could be argued as a misunderstanding rather than a fraud. What they needed was the pattern, the repetition of it, the consistency that turned a misunderstanding into a method. Ed Faraday was going to be important. She was thinking about this when Eli Turner came into the kitchen at 5 o'clock, earlier than usual, and stood in the doorway with an expression that suggested he had something he wanted to say and wasn't sure how to start. You're up early, she said. Couldn't sleep, he said. He came in and poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. He was 19 and sometimes seemed younger and sometimes seemed older, depending on what the day required of him. This morning he seemed somewhere in between. Is it true you're going to Caldwell today? To fight Hale? Word traveled fast in a bunkhouse. Colt's going to talk to some people, she said. I'm going with him. Roy says you found something in the records about the loan. Roy talks a lot for a quiet man, she said. He says you might be able to keep the ranch. She looked at Eli carefully. He was holding his coffee cup in both hands and looking at her with the particular intensity of someone who has more invested in a situation than they've said out loud. How long have you worked here? She asked. 3 seasons, he said. My dad worked here before me, before he died. He was quiet for a moment. This place is... He stopped, searching for something. My cousin Danny, he's got other options. I don't much, and I don't want them. He looked at her directly. I want this to work out. She looked at him steadily. He was 19 and fatherless and trying hard at things that were genuinely hard, and underneath the anxiousness was something solid, the same quality she had seen in the field when he fixed his bundles and didn't make a production out of it. We're going to try, she said. That's the honest answer. He nodded, seeming to accept that this was the kind of answer that was worth something. Can I do anything? He said. Keep the yard running while we're gone, she said. Roy will have work for you, and check the wheat stacks at noon. Make sure the tarp's held overnight. He nodded again, more firmly. He had a task. That helped. She understood the particular way it helped, the same way it had always helped her snap back. Colt came back from Faraday's at midday with the expression of a man who has had a harder conversation than expected and come out the other side of it. She was in the yard when he rode in, and she waited while he dismounted and walked the horse to the barn. How did it go? She asked, falling into step beside him. Faraday's angry, Colt said. Has been for a while, apparently. His payment last spring was higher than he expected, and he couldn't figure out why. He argued with the bank about it and got told he'd misread the terms. He paused. He has the same clause. He'll come to Caldwell? Tuesday morning. He wasn't happy about it. He had to think about it for an hour while I sat in his front room and his wife gave me coffee and pretended everything was normal. He shook his head slightly. Ed Faraday is a stubborn man. So are you, she said. He glanced at her sideways. His wife is the one who convinced him. She'd already figured out something was wrong with the numbers. She just didn't know what to do about it. She thought about that. 2 women on 2 separate ranches, looking at the same numbers and finding the same wrongness independently. There was something in that worth thinking about, but this was not the time to think about it. Whitmore's office is on the north end of Main Street, Colt said. I sent word ahead that we'd be there at 2. Good, she said. I'll get the documents. Then Whitmore was 81 years old, or somewhere in that neighborhood, and he occupied his office the way old men occupy their particular chairs, with the settled permanence of something that had grown into the space over many years and become indistinguishable from it. The office was full of books and papers, and the particular dusty order of a man who knew exactly where everything was and would notice immediately if anything were moved. He looked at Greta when they came in and said, You're not from here. No, she said. I'm from Germany, originally. I can hear that, he said. Sit down, both of you. He read what she had put together in about 15 minutes, which was faster than she'd expected, and she watched his face while he read. The slight movements of his expression, the way his attention sharpened at the clause on page 3, and then again at the record she had copied from the county office. When he finished, he set the documents down and looked at her. You found this yourself? He said. In the public records? Yes. How long did it take you? 2 hours, roughly. He looked at Colt. Where did you find her? Telegram, Colt said. Harvest work. Whitmore made a sound that might have been amusement. He picked up the page with the interest calculation and looked at it again. The clause itself isn't illegal on its face, he said. Quarterly compounding exists in legitimate loan instruments. I know, Greta said. But the initial agreement document, the one Colt signed, describes the payment schedule in language consistent with annual simple interest. The quarterly clause is subordinate and written to be obscured by the surrounding language. That's a misrepresentation of terms, Whitmore said. Yes, possibly fraudulent misrepresentation, if it can be shown it was deliberate. He set the page down. The pattern you found in the records is what makes it deliberate. 1 instance is a mistake. 4 instances with the same structure, the same buried language, all on properties with access to Mercer Creek water rights. He tapped the page. That's not a mistake. No, she said. It's not. Whitmore looked at her for a moment with the assessing eyes of a very old man who has seen enough to know the difference between someone who understands what they're talking about and someone who is performing understanding. "You're not a lawyer," he said. "No. But you've dealt with contracts, accounts, financial instruments." "Supply house work," she said, "and I read carefully." He nodded slowly. "Hale won't be easy to move," he said. "He has friends on the county commission, and the circuit judge has done business with his bank." "Is Judge Aldrin corrupt?" Colt asked. "Not exactly," Whitmore said. "He's comfortable. He's accustomed to things working in certain ways. What we're asking him to do is look at something that inconveniences a man he plays cards with." He paused. "Which is why the evidence needs to be airtight. Aldrin won't stick his neck out, but he won't ignore the law if it's laid in front of him plainly enough." "Can you present it?" Greta asked. Whitmore looked at her. "You want me to take this case?" "Yes." "I'm retired." "I know," she said. "But you still have your license and you're standing with the court. We don't." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the records she had copied and looked through them again, more slowly this time. She waited. "You know why Hale and I don't get along?" he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "I heard that you didn't, but not why." 15 years ago, he tried to do something similar to a young couple who had just bought the Arlen property south of town. Small place, good soil. He had them in a loan instrument that didn't hold up to scrutiny. Whitmore set the papers down. "I was still practicing then. I helped them. Hale did not forgive it." "Paswasiem, mas matij." He paused. "He's been more careful since, more patient, more thorough." He looked at Greta. "What you found is the most solid documentation anyone has put together against him in 15 years. She didn't say anything. "I'm 81 years old," Whitmore said. "I don't need the work, and I don't need the money, but I'll take this case." He looked at Colt. "My fee is whatever you can manage when it's over. I'm not interested in adding to your financial difficulties at the moment." Colt looked at him steadily. "Thank you," he said. The same way he had thanked Greta. Simple, direct, no performance. "Don't thank me yet," Whitmore said, and reached for a clean sheet of paper. Hans. The next 4 days were the most concentrated work Greta had done since she arrived at Iron Ridge, and she had not done light work since she arrived. She and Whitmore met twice more before Tuesday, once on Saturday afternoon and once on Monday morning, and each meeting was a working session rather than a consultation. Whitmore would identify what he needed, and she would either have it or would go find it, and she found that his mind, which was old but not slow, worked in a way that was compatible with hers, precise and sequential, interested in what could be demonstrated rather than what felt true. On Sunday, she rode out to the Broken Bow Ranch again, this time with a list of specific questions Whitmore needed answered, and she sat at Ed Faraday's kitchen table while his wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen, who shook Greta's hand with the grip of someone accustomed to hard work, put coffee on and listened with open attention. Ed Faraday was a large, weathered man with a slow way of talking that she had initially mistaken for reluctance and later understood was simply thoroughness. He did not say things until he was sure of them, which meant that when he said them, they were worth hearing. He answered Whitmore's questions precisely. He produced his own copy of his loan document and showed her the same clause in slightly different language, the same quarterly compounding, the same buried subordinate position, the same initial agreement that described a simple interest schedule. "When did you first notice the discrepancy?" she asked. "Last spring payment," he said. "Numbers didn't match what I'd expected. Bank told me I'd made an error." "Did you sign anything acknowledging the higher amount?" "I paid it," he said. "Wasn't happy about it, but I paid it. I couldn't afford to fight it." She looked at him steadily. "You can afford to fight it now, because you're fighting it with other people." He held her gaze. "I wasn't sure about this," he said. "Colt and I have had our differences." "I know," she said. "He told me." "Fence line business," Ed said. He made a slight dismissive gesture. "Petty, in retrospect." "It usually is," she said. Helen Faraday, from the kitchen counter, made a sound that expressed comprehensive agreement without saying a word. Monday night, Greta sat in the kitchen after everyone had gone to sleep and read through what Whitmore had prepared, checking the numbers one more time with the focused attention of a person who knows that a single error can unravel something built carefully over days. It held. The argument held. She could see, in Whitmore's formal legal language, the shape of what she had found in the records office, the pattern that turned a discrepancy into a method, the method that turned a method into a fraud, the fraud that had been taking land and water rights from people who couldn't fight it because they didn't know what they were looking at. She knew what she was looking at. She had always known how to look. Colt came into the kitchen at 11 o'clock. She hadn't heard him get up, but she wasn't entirely surprised. She had noticed over the past 2 weeks that he slept poorly when something was unresolved. She could hear the particular creak of the floorboards in the room above the kitchen that meant he was moving around instead of resting. He came in and didn't say anything, just poured the last of the cold coffee and sat down across from her. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you," he said. "I'm almost done." He looked at the papers in front of her. "Is it going to work?" She thought about the honest answer. "I don't know," she said. "Whitmore thinks the evidence is solid. The pattern is clear. If Aldrin applies the law as it's written, we win." She paused. "If Aldrin decides that inconveniencing Hale isn't worth his political discomfort, we may not. What are the chances?" "I don't know." She looked at him. "I've never done this before." "You've done everything else for the first time," he said. "Seems like you've managed." She didn't answer right away. She looked at the lamp between them and thought about that. The accumulation of first times that had gotten her from a town in Germany to a kitchen table in Kansas with documents that might save a man's land from being swallowed by someone who had been patient enough to build a trap over years. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I came here," she said, "I had $37 and a telegram and nowhere else to go. That was the complete picture." She kept her eyes on the lamp. "I wasn't looking for anything except work, a place to be useful. I'd stopped expecting more than that." She paused. "This," she made a gesture that encompassed the papers, the kitchen, all of it. "This is more than I expected." He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet she had come to understand as him listening past the words, the way he listened to machinery, not just what was said, but what was underneath it. "I need to tell you something too," he said. She looked at him. "When you first showed up," he said, "Roy asked me what I thought, whether I'd made the right call hiring someone without references." "What did you tell him?" "I said I didn't know yet." He looked at his coffee cup. 3 days later, I told him I thought maybe I had. He told me he'd known on the second day." He glanced up. "Roy's rarely wrong about people." She held his gaze. The lamp was burning lower now, and the kitchen had the particular quality of late night, when everything felt slightly more exposed than it did in daylight. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know that this place—" He stopped. The thing he was trying to say was fighting with how he was accustomed to saying things, which was not easily or with much elaboration. "You've changed what this place is," he said. "In 3 weeks. I don't know how to—" Another stop. "You don't have to," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I know," she said. He nodded. He drank the last of his cold coffee and stood up. "Get some sleep," he said. "You'll need it tomorrow." "You too," she said. He went back down the hall, and she listened to the floorboards above the kitchen, and for the first time in the 2 weeks she had been at Iron Ridge, they didn't creak again. He slept. She sat for a while longer with the papers and the low lamp, and then she went to sleep too. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cold, the first genuinely cold morning since the storm, and Greta dressed carefully. Her better dress, her good coat, her hair put up in the way that said she was going somewhere that required being taken seriously. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the inside of her door and saw what she always saw, which was a 34-year-old German woman with rough hands and an accent and a face that didn't arrange itself into prettiness easily. She had long ago stopped wishing for different. She went to make breakfast. Colt came down in his good shirt and his town boots, which she had not seen him wear before, and Roy took one look at both of them and said nothing, which meant he understood the gravity of the morning. Eli Turner hovered at the edge of the kitchen with the particular anxiousness of someone who wants to help and knows this is not the kind of help he can give. "We'll be back by evening," Colt told the crew. Roy's in charge. Roy nodded. It didn't need more than that. The Caldwell Courthouse was a two-story brick building on the east end of Main Street, and Judge Aldrin held his sessions in the upper room, which had tall windows and the smell of old paper and the particular acoustic quality of rooms where decisions had been made for a long time. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the settled look of someone accustomed to authority, and he looked at the assembled parties with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally not especially pleased. Hale was there. She had expected that. Whitmore had filed the counterpetition Friday afternoon, and Hale would have been notified. He sat on his side of the room with a lawyer she didn't recognize, a younger man from out of town, and he looked at Greta when she came in with the expression of a man recalibrating what he was dealing with. Ed Faraday was there with Helen, which was not legally required and had not been discussed. And when Greta saw Helen Faraday sitting in the gallery with her hands folded and her chin level, something in her chest settled. Whitmore presented the case in the careful, unhurried way of a man who has been building arguments in courtrooms for 50 years and knows that patience is not the same as slowness. He laid out the interest calculation first, simple, clear, documented, and then the comparison with the described terms in the initial agreement, and then the records Greta had found, laid side by side so that the pattern was visible without requiring anyone to look very hard. Hale's lawyer objected twice. Whitmore addressed both objections with the particular courtesy of someone who has already anticipated them and finds them less interesting than the questioner hopes. Then Aldrin asked to see the documents himself. He read them in the way Whitmore had read them, careful and complete. She watched his face while he read, the same way she had watched Whitmore's face, and she saw the same sequence, attention sharpening at the clause on page 3, and again at the copied records, and again at the side-by-side interest calculation. Hale's lawyer spoke at length about the legitimacy of the loan terms, and the bank's compliance with county regulations, and the misfortune of the weather event that had caused the yield shortfall. He was a capable speaker, she thought, smooth, confident, the kind of man accustomed to making complicated things sound simple in his favor. When he finished, Aldrin looked at the documents again. Mr. Whitmore, he'd said, the counterpetition argues misrepresentation of terms at the time of signing. What evidence do you have that Mr. Mercer was not informed of the quarterly compounding structure? Whitmore stood. Your Honor, the initial agreement document, he indicated it on the table, describes the payment schedule in language consistent exclusively with annual simple interest. There is no mention of quarterly compounding in the initial agreement. The subordinate clause appears only in the full loan instrument, on page 3, embedded in procedural language. If Mr. Hale's institution informed Mr. Mercer verbally of the quarterly structure, that verbal communication should be documented in the bank's records. We would ask that those records be produced. Silence. Hale's lawyer conferred in a low voice with his client. She watched Hale's face during this, the controlled expression of a man who was calculating rather than reacting, which was what made him dangerous, and what also meant he was not entirely sure of the ground beneath him. Furthermore, Whitmore continued, we have identified 3 additional properties. He produced the Faraday documents, one of whose owners is present today, carrying loan instruments from the Caldwell Commercial Bank with the identical subordinate clause in the identical position and identical language. The consistency of this pattern across multiple instruments, all held against properties with access to Mercer Creek water rights, constitutes evidence of a systematic practice rather than a drafting irregularity. Aldrin looked at the Faraday documents. He looked at them for a long time. Mr. Hale, he said. Hale stood with the careful composure of a man who had been in difficult rooms before. Your Honor, the bank's loan instruments are drafted to our standard specifications. Your standard specifications, Aldrin said, appear to differ from the terms presented to borrowers at signing. A pause. That would be a matter for the bank's legal counsel to address, Hale said. It would, Aldrin said, and it is being addressed. He set the documents down. I'm going to be direct, Mr. Hale. What I have in front of me is documentation of a systematic discrepancy between terms presented to borrowers and terms written into final loan instruments. That discrepancy, applied consistently across multiple properties with a shared natural resource, suggests a purpose beyond routine lending practice. He looked at Hale directly. I'm not prepared to rule on the full scope of this today. However, I am prepared to rule on the immediate question of Mr. Mercer's foreclosure notice. Hale's lawyer was on his feet. Your Honor, the notice was filed on the basis of a default calculation derived from the contested interest structure, Aldrin said. Until the legitimacy of that structure is determined, the foreclosure notice is suspended. He looked at both sides of the room. I'm ordering a full review of the Caldwell Commercial Bank's loan instruments for properties in this county. That review will be conducted by the county auditor's office. In the meantime, no foreclosure action may proceed against Iron Ridge Ranch. He picked up his gavel. We'll reconvene in 30 days for the review findings. The gavel came down. She let out a breath she had not entirely known she was holding. Outside the courthouse, in the clean, cold air, Ed Faraday shook Colt's hand and then looked at Greta and extended his hand to her as well. She shook it. Helen figured it out first, he said, which was both an admission and a compliment. Helen Faraday beside him gave Greta the brief nod of one practical woman to another. Whitmore emerged from the building with his case and the slight satisfaction of a man who has done a thing he was good at. It's not over, he said, before anyone could celebrate. The review will take the full 30 days, and Hale will spend every one of them finding ways to complicate the findings. But the ranch is safe for now, Colt said. For now, Whitmore said. Yes, Colt looked at Greta. She was standing in the courthouse steps in her good coat with the cold sunlight on her face, and she felt something she did not immediately have a name for. Not triumph, which was too loud, not relief, which was too simple. Something in between. Something that felt like the moment after you set down a heavy thing you have been carrying for a long time and discover that your hands are still intact. You did this, Colt said. Whitmore did this, she said. And you, and the Faradays. You found it, he said. She looked at him. There was something in his face she had been trying not to look at directly for several days now. The way you don't look directly at certain things because looking makes them real, and real things have weight and consequence. But she looked at it now, in the cold autumn light outside the courthouse, and she saw what it was, and she didn't look away from it. Let's go home, she said. Colt was quiet for a moment, the words sitting between them. Home, with all the specific gravity that one small word could carry. Yes, he said. Let's. They walked to where the horses were tied, and Whitmore went his own way down the street with a promise to write when the auditor's office made contact. And Ed and Helen Faraday went to their wagon, and Greta untied her horse and stood for a moment looking down Main Street at Caldwell, the place that had closed every door to her 3 weeks ago, where she had sat on a bench outside the post office with a wrinkled telegram and $41 and no particular reason for hope. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up and turned the horse north toward the ridge country, where the October grass was gold and brown and the wheat stacks stood covered against the next weather, and she rode. The ride back to Iron Ridge took 40 minutes, and they rode most of it without talking. Not the uncomfortable silence of people with nothing to say, but the quieter kind. The kind that settles between two people after something large has happened, and neither of them is ready to reduce it to words yet. The October light was doing what October light does in the ridge country. That particular low-angle gold that made even the storm-damaged fields look like something worth keeping. Greta watched it move across the grass and thought about the courtroom and Aldrin's gavel and the expression on Hale's face when the suspension was announced. Not rage exactly, but the particular tightening of a man who has discovered that the machinery he built has a gear that doesn't turn the way he expected. When the ranch gate came into sight, Colt spoke. 30 days is not a long time, he said. No, she agreed. But Whitmore will watch the audit, and the Faradays are involved now. It's harder to suppress a pattern when more than one property is documented. She paused. We should also write to the two families who already lost their land. They may want to be part of the record. He nodded. They passed through the gate, and Roy came out of the barn with the expression of a man who had been watching the road for hours and was trying not to show it. Well, he said. Foreclosure suspended, Colt said. 30-day review. Roy looked at Greta. You're doing? Whitmore's, she said. Whitmore wouldn't have had anything to work with without her, Colt said, and Roy absorbed this and nodded in the way that meant he was filing it permanently. Eli Turner appeared in the barn doorway. When he heard the word suspended, he looked at Greta with something so openly relieved she had to glance away from it briefly. Go wash up, she told them all. Supper in an hour. But she made the best meal she could with what was in the pantry, a ham she had been saving without consciously acknowledging why. Roasted potatoes, a proper gravy. The crew sat around the table with a looseness that hadn't been there before. The particular ease of people who have been holding their breath and have finally been given reason to exhale. Pete Doss told a story about a runaway reaper and a disoriented mule, and the table laughed at it, fully, without reserve. And she laughed too, and realized it had been a while since she'd done that without something held back. After supper, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse, Colt came back downstairs and stood at the kitchen window the way she had stood there on her first morning. I owe you $37, he said. You owe me $37 when the ranch is stable, she said. Not before. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him working toward something. The harvest season is over, he said. She kept drying the dish in her hands. Yes. Your hire was for harvest. Yes. Are you going to make me ask directly? He said. She set the dish down and turned to look at him. He was watching her with his honest face, not the managed expression he wore in daylight when the crew was around, but the one that appeared when the house was quiet and he was left with whatever was actually true. I want to stay, she said. The silence that followed had weight and texture, the specific quality of something said plainly after a long time of not being said. I can't offer you much, he said. Not until the restructuring takes effect. The room off the kitchen, a real salary come January, the work itself. He paused. That's what I have. She thought about the hook on the back of her door, the window that looked out at the yard, the table where they'd sat with the lamp between them and documents spread out and something building in the space between two people who were paying attention to the same things. You're offering me work, she said. A place. People who are not indifferent to whether I'm here. He held her gaze. That's a modest description, he said quietly. I'm a modest person, she said, which was not entirely true and they both knew it, and a corner of his mouth moved. Stay, he said, past harvest, as long as you want. I intend to, she said, and turned back to the dishes. The 30 days were not easy. Hale filed procedural objections, counter-arguments, a new filing about a secondary clause that she had to take to Whitmore's office and spend 2 hours unpacking. She went to the Faradays again. Helen met her at the door before she could knock. We heard about the new filing, Helen said. Come in. Ed Faraday gave a sworn statement that the secondary clause had never been explained to him at signing, the same as the primary terms had never been explained. When Greta asked if he'd put that in writing, it was Helen who answered. Yes, she said, for both of them. On the drive home, Greta thought about Helen Faraday, and about all the Helen Faradays, looking at wrong numbers in kitchens on ranches across the county, and finding the wrongness and not being able to do much about it because the courthouse was a building where their testimony was heard with a skepticism that had nothing to do with whether they were telling the truth. This was what Hale had relied on, she thought. The accumulated weight of people believing the room they needed was not for them. She had stopped believing that. She wasn't sure exactly when, but she had. The audit finding came on the 28th day. Whitmore sent a boy out with a letter, and she read it at the kitchen table while the breakfast dishes were still on it. 7 of 11 Caldwell commercial bank loan instruments contained the buried quarterly compounding clause. In 5 cases, including Iron Ridge, it had never been disclosed at signing. The auditor characterized the practice as systematic misrepresentation and recommended referral to the state banking authority. The 2 defaulted properties were named in the report. She set the letter down and sat with it. Colt came in from the yard, saw her face, and stopped. She handed him the letter. He read it standing up. She watched his face go through it, the stillness that settled over him at the middle, the slight change in his breathing at the end. He lowered the letter. It's over? The foreclosure is over, she said. The state investigation will take longer, and the families who lost their land, that will take longer still. But you're not going anywhere. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at the letter between them. My father bought this land in 1871, he said. He was 23 years old with 2 horses and a mule and the filing fee. He used to say the land doesn't care who you are. Only what you do with it." He looked up. I think he was only half right. "What's the other half?" she asked. "The people on it," he said. "The land doesn't care. But the people do." She held his gaze and thought about her father in Germany fixing things they couldn't afford to replace, and Hans driving the mule in the Ohio summer, and the bench outside the post office, and the folded telegram and $41, and the accumulated weight of every closed door. She thought about what she had come to believe, not because anyone told her, but because she had lived enough of it to trust it. That the people who got something real out of life were rarely the ones handed the most to start with. They were the ones who paid close attention, who looked at what was in the room and worked with it, who stayed in a hard situation long enough to understand it before deciding what to do, and who, when they found themselves next to someone who saw the same things they saw, who recognized them, in the plain, honest sense of actually seeing what was there, had the sense to stay. "Your father was right about the work," she said. "And you're right about the people." She paused. "Neither one is enough without the other." He looked at her for a moment, then he folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. She recognized the gesture. It was the same thing she had done with the telegram on the bench in Caldwell. In January, Whitmore came out personally to deliver the final signed documents. The loan restructured, the payment schedule recalculated, the foreclosure notice voided by the court without ceremony, just a piece of paper that ceased to exist. Before he left, he told her that the civil case on behalf of the defaulted properties had cleared its first procedural hurdle. He also told her that what she had copied from the county records office was cited 3 times in the first 10 pages of the complaint. "The 2 families who might get their land back," he said. "That starts with what you found." She thought about the names in the records, people she had never met, whose land had been absorbed into a holding company with a registered address and no face. "I hope they get it back," she said. "So do I," Whitmore said, with the honesty of a man who had been hoping for outcomes for 50 years and knew the difference between hope and certainty. "But at minimum, what happened to them is on the record now. That matters too." She stood in the kitchen after he left and thought about that, about things being on the record. A loan document burying the truth, a copy of that document surfacing it, a court filing naming what had been done. Someone, somewhere, reading it and knowing they had been seen. She had always believed in the power of looking carefully at what was actually there, of writing things down accurately, of not looking away from what the numbers said. It was not a heroic quality, it was just a quality. But it had turned out to be the one that made the difference. Spring came slowly to the ridge country. She noticed it first in the kitchen window, the light arriving at a slightly different angle, carrying something warmer underneath the cold. She stood there with her coffee and watched it and thought about belonging, about how long she had gone without it. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just the ordinary, persistent absence of a place where you were known and where your presence was considered a good thing rather than a neutral thing or a problem. She had not understood how much it mattered until she stopped lacking it. Roy came in from the barn before the oatmeal was done. "Eastfield's thawed enough to start prep work this week," he said. "I know," she said. "Seed orders confirmed for Thursday." He poured his coffee and sat down. That was all. It was enough. Colt came in 20 minutes later and Eli after him, and she put the food on the table and they ate together in the easy, unremarkable way of people whose daily life had found its rhythm. Enough hard things survived together, enough mornings like this one accumulated to where it stopped feeling provisional and started feeling like what it was. She thought, this is what home is. Not a place that was given to you, not a place that decided to tolerate you. A place where the people made decisions every ordinary day that assumed you were part of the plan. She had arrived with the suitcase and $37 and a telegram folded soft at the creases, and no particular reason to expect more than one more door closing in her face. She was leaving none of that behind her. She was carrying it forward the way you carry everything that made you into the life it made you for. The morning light came through the window and lay across the table and across the faces of the people sitting around it. And it was ordinary, and it was enough, and it was exactly what she had been working toward without knowing it had a name.